What I should be doing this afternoon is answering, or trying to answer, that question, which might seem rather a bizarre question, actually, if you bear in mind that the civil servants who worked with Winston Churchill in the Second World War used to regard him as scientifically clueless, as one of them put it. And of course, you may know that when he was at school, Churchill was no great student of the sciences. He hated the comical hieroglyphics of mathematics and was always searching for some sort of concrete meaning for the abstractions he saw and heard about in his science lessons. But nonetheless, I think this is a question we should take seriously, as I hope to persuade you. And I also want to give you a sense of Churchill's appreciation of science and technology and how that developed over his lifetime. And I will argue that it was that appreciation that gave an additional valuable dimension to his leadership, both as a politician and later as an international statesman. Churchill's father didn't regard him as sufficiently talented to go to university. Churchill entered the army training course at Sandhurst and began his career as a soldier. This, ladies and gentlemen, for me, this next episode, or this first episode, is to me the most interesting one, the one that hasn't been studied enough in my view. After he became a soldier, when he was a subaltern in Bangalore, India, in the winter of 1896, he set up his own private open university and decided to read his way into what you might call a liberal education. We know of his commitment to Macaulay, to Gibbon, and to the other great writers. What is less well known that he was reading Darwin, The Origin of Species. He was also reading Samuel Lang's popular book, Modern Science and Modern Thought. He also began reading his an author who was to become one of his great favourites, HG Wells. Somehow, in that education, he came to realise that if he was going to be a politician, and that was pretty much his what he wanted to do in life, he felt he needed to know some science, some technology, and about how to apply those subjects when given the reins of power. Not something I would suggest that is particularly common today in aspiring politicians of any stripe. Actually, that wasn't meant to be funny, but I suppose it is in a way. It's his relationship with Wells that I believe is central to understanding much of Churchill's attitude to science and technology, and indeed to warfare. Churchill wrote in later life that he read every single book that H.G. Wells published twice. In November 1901, Wells wrote his first non-fiction book. Wells was not a great stylist in the sense of a Henry James or a James Joyce, but he was blessed with the most wonderful foresight and imagination. And that's what attracted the admiration of Henry James, of Joseph Conrad, and others. Here was a special mind, and Churchill realised that. And in the book Anticipations, Wells waxed reasonably lyrically on the future of technology in education and warfare, and let his fecund imagination pretty much run amok. This was the kind of stuff that was meat and drink to the new Member of Parliament, Winston Churchill, who sought out Wells, and the two men met on the 6th of March 1902 in the House of Commons lobby. I'd give a lot of money, or at least as much money as I have, to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting. So Churchill, the young politician, was alert to watch out for new technology and see how it might impact on military matters and on civil matters. So it's no surprise that soon after the Wright brothers made their first flight, it was Churchill who was the first politician to urge the government to contact the Wright brothers and see what this invention, he later called it this hellish invention of the aeroplane, the impact that it might have, particularly on his beloved United Kingdom, an island race vulnerable suddenly to attacks over the water that, of course, were completely out of the question before. Now, during the First World War, Churchill occupied a place in government. According to Lloyd George, his boss, it was Churchill who was more responsible than anyone else for the pioneering of the tank. And it was Churchill, incidentally, privately gave credit to HG Wells for that invention and went to court to attest to Wells's priority in that matter. During that war too, Churchill had became acquainted with the horror of the new type of weaponry, chemical weapons that had potential for mass slaughter. And we see in his writings at that time, they're capable of multiple interpretation, but Churchill, it appears, was not particularly squeamish about using those weapons. But he saw that the age that Wells had foreseen of where weapons could be increasingly powerful would play a bigger and bigger part in the way we prosecute war. Now, in the early 1920s, Wells, who was never Churchill's cup of tea politically, they were poles apart, although it has to be said friends, and they would meet more than occasionally. Churchill's primary scientific influence became this gentleman here on your left. This is Frederick Linderman, an Oxford professor of physics, here with the quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger in I believe, in Schrödinger's garden. Now, Linderman was a politically more conservative than Churchill. He was ambitious politically. He was a good, solid scientist. And he was very keen to get into Churchill's orbit. And he became what we would now call Churchill's go-to person for scientific advice, any kind of advice on technical matters. And it's very clear, and if you follow Churchill's thinking, that he gains more confidence in talking about science and technology through his association with Linderman, and we see that through the absolutely prodigious journalistic output of Churchill. In 1925, for example, we see an article that Churchill was particularly proud of called "Shall We All Commit Suicide?" Think of those poisoned gas raids in the First World War. It was there that he mentions for the first time a bomb the size of an orange that could wipe out cities. He was referring to what Wells had christened the atomic bombs. That term was introduced 101 years ago in a book, The World Set Free. The year after that is an incident still my favourite of the Churchill science anecdotes, the people who are dismissive of any thought that Churchill might really be interested in science. It was in that year, 1926, pressed with a budget at a very difficult time. Remember, the general strike was looming, that Churchill set aside the preparations for that budget and spent about 2 hours in his study dictating a summary of quantum theory. You can read it. It's quite good. You can read it and you can see Linderman's influence in providing Churchill with a book that Churchill read. Can you imagine today's Chancellor of the Exchequer of any stripe doing that? I ask you. 5 years later, his pièce de résistance, a wonderful essay that you can read, I hear illegally, not by the account of mine, on the web, called 50 Years Hence. Here you would see Churchill writing about what life might be like in 50 years' time. That would be, 1981, as a result of scientific and technological developments. The article was drafted by Linderman and tweaked and given a kind of sheen by Churchill. So there, go and read it if you want to tonight or this afternoon on your mobile phone, and you will see him writing about mobile phones, lab-grown livestock. Incidentally, that first appeared 2 years ago in the summer, just in case you think he wasn't far ahead of his time. And most interestingly, for the purposes of this talk, he was talking about the release of nuclear energy. That's the energy stored in the core of atoms. That was unknown then. The term did not exist in the general public, among discourse in the general public. But Churchill was talking about harnessing that kind of energy. And in one completely remarkable sentence, he talks about scientists, this was in 1931, hunting for the match to light that fire. In other words, the way of releasing nuclear energy. Ladies and gentlemen, that was 9 weeks before the discovery of the neutron, which was the particle that lit that nuclear fire. Amazes me that more people have not picked up on that. It may have been picked up by his fan, James Chadwick, who was a discoverer of the neutron. Linderman was, it turned out eventually, the most regular or frequent visitor to Churchill's country seat in Chartwell. His family called Linderman the Prof. He was the Prof, not particularly popular with his scientific peers, but very popular in the Churchill household. And it was through that meeting that Churchill got advice and counsel on scientific technological matters, and through those conversations that emerged a string of articles that read well today. Lucid, well-informed, not fanatical in any sense, just, in my opinion, very good pieces of popular journalism. If you read them, you will see a Wellesian perspective on science in warfare, a disdain for the old worship of the hero general, and a fascination with the idea that future wars will be fought through high-tech, high scientific principles. But you also see a Lindermanian detail. Linderman was very much au courant with modern science and technology, and he brought that to the Churchillian table. 4 of those articles, believe it or not, made it perfectly clear to his readers in the News of the World. That's 4 million people were reading that, the biggest readership of any newspaper in the world. So even if a fraction of those read it, it was still reaching a large cohort of people. Churchill talked about the release of nuclear energy. Right? This was, I stress again, the mid-1930s. Scientists could not harness energy at that time, but Churchill said this may happen. This, ladies and gentlemen, I submit, was completely remarkable. And this is the most remarkable article of all. It was published in October 1938, where just that possibility was mentioned. That at a time, remember, when there was talk of another war with Nazi Germany, of another global upheaval, and here's Churchill aware that nuclear energy at that time in history might be on the verge of being released. Now, you may be surprised. Why is Churchill writing about science here? All right, we know about Linderman, but this is extraordinary. I've never heard of him talk about science and technology. Now, if that is your view, that wasn't the case at the time, because at the time Churchill and Linderman were a kind of Tweedledum Tweedledee in Westminster, because they were both hounding government committees, urging them to increase the support, financial support, and their preparedness for an aerial attack. They wanted to develop aerial defences in ways that Linderman was briefing Churchill on. So this was a very important part of the Linderman-Churchill axis. And one thing that is surprising and disappointing for admirers of Churchill, initially he did not make it easy for the people who were developing radar, although eventually, thank heaven, he did change his mind. What I think is so powerful about these articles, and this one in particular, is that about 8 weeks after that article was published in the News of the World came something that was a complete shock to virtually all physicists. In Hitler's capital, Berlin, 2 scientists discovered the process that we now call nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium nuclei by neutron beams with a huge release of energy, nuclear energy. This was the event that showed or indicated that it might be possible to harness huge amounts of energy stored in nuclei. And as has been said before, this can be regarded as one of the cruelest tricks that fate paid on the 20th century. The idea that this scientific development happened right on the eve of the what would turn out to be the most violent conflict in global history. And this, as I shall describe in a moment, is something that was an important factor, as we now realise, in Churchill's premiership. We know he became Prime Minister in May 1940, and this is where he has the chance to bring the full preparedness of his scientific and technological awareness to government. And boy, did he do it. Within days of moving into 10 Downing Street, he brought Linderman in as his scientific advisor, and the normal working day for them was to work in Westminster and to share a drink late into the evening. Linderman was a true confidant of Churchill's. And the list of scientific and technological initiatives that they put through is, I think, quite impressive. For a start, Linderman was in charge of what was called a statistical branch, the aim of which was to give the Prime Minister disinterested statistical information about the state of the economy and about the state of the the British and Commonwealth fighting machine. The idea was data, data, data. Churchill didn't trust the kind of counsel he was getting from his so-called experts, his civil servants, and from military authorities. He wanted a scientific, in inverted commas, presentation of that information. And Linderman corralled a bunch of experts, particularly from the University of Oxford, where he was based, and provided Churchill with that information throughout the war. Belatedly, they got behind radar, which was the crucial or a crucial technology that enabled Britain to put up some kind of fight against the Luftwaffe. Let's not forget MD1, Ministry of Defence 1, nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop, where all manner of gizmos, weapons and devices and ruses were hatched. The sticky bomb, the handheld anti-tank gun, the limpet mine, and so on. It's worth noting, lest this comes across too much of a eulogy, that there were many leading scientists, including Patrick Blackett, Mark Oliphant, who thought that Churchill was much too absorbed with these, what he called boys' toys, and that the strategic attitude to science was missing in Churchill's leadership. That's something that one can, of course, debate. What was not debatable was his support for the code breakers at Bletchley Park. Winston Churchill called these people the geese who laid the golden eggs and never cackled. He was thinking of Alan Turing, not specifically Alan Turing. No, he didn't write a letter to Turing, as you saw in the Hollywood movie a few months ago, but Churchill knew how valuable that the breaking of the Enigma code and those other triumphs that took place at Bletchley were. This is science, make no mistake about it. Turing was a first-class mathematical scientist, and it was those skills that were brought to bear on those code-cracking activities, and Churchill fully appreciated them, just as he had done in the First World War. And finally, related to the statistical branch work, let's not forget the developing science of operational research, which again brings scientific and mathematical matters, so that you are not just talking about who's got the loudest voice, who's the most senior commander, but what is science and technology telling you about how best to run a convoy, how best to run an aircraft flying pattern, and what have you. Those things develop particularly rapidly in the war. One thing that is not, in my opinion, sufficiently stressed is that Churchill, it was May 1940 that he became Prime Minister, and among the items that was floating around in those hectic days when he was bringing so much energy and imagination and fortitude to the leadership of the war, there were papers that had come down from the University of Birmingham, where two scientists by the name of Otto Frisch and Rudolf Piles had hit on the idea of how to make a nuclear weapon. Now, the first thing to say is this was regarded by everyone rightly as extremely speculative, the kind of thing that you just, like a piece of junk mail you get through the post. You think, oh, I'm not going to bother me about that. We've got a war to fight. And yet the stakes here were very high, because those two scientists, classed by the government as enemy aliens, they were both in some sense refugees from Europe, that those studies showed from the University of Birmingham, notice not Oxford or Cambridge, but from that town in the Midlands there, showed that it might be possible to build a weapon that could obliterate a city, just as Wells had foreseen in 1914. This idea was developed, I have to say, with commendable calmness, straightforwardness and openness within the confines of government, of course. The government set up something called the Maud Committee, which Linderman was on. And at that time, again, not often stressed, Britain was way ahead of the United States in the idea of building nuclear weapons. The idea of building those weapons was finally approved by Churchill in August 1941, when he became, as we now know, the first national leader to approve the building of that new type of weapon, something he was particularly proud of. In October 1941, by that time, America was girding up very rapidly. Its gigantic economy, its wonderfully capable scientists, no more capable than ours, but the wonderfully capable scientists. Through this man here, he actually offered Churchill, he sent Churchill a handwritten note saying that he hoped that any extended efforts on building this new weapon may be coordinated or even jointly conducted. He was offering him a partnership in building those weapons. And for reasons, if you want to understand them, read my book, Churchill did not answer that message for 7 weeks. There's complex reasons for that, but one thing is for sure, that Britain fell way behind the United States while always having a kind of cooperation, and in the end, Churchill pretty much had to go cap in hand to his friend and the person he admired so much, Roosevelt, and virtually beg him for the opportunity to be involved in the colossal Manhattan Project, the biggest project, science and technology, military project the world had ever seen, which Churchill did, on his terms, deftly negotiate in August 1943. But among the tens of thousands of people working on that project and hundreds of absolutely first-rate scientists, Britain in the end contributed 24. But they were doing important work, and let's not forget the early role that is often forgotten. Part of that agreement in Quebec was that if that bomb were dropped, it would not be used against each other, of course, but also that the leaders of both countries had to approve it. So when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Churchill's signature was required, and he gave it, and he never regretted it. After the war, we all know that Churchill was given, as he put it, the Order of the Boot, and he went in, someone like this, even though he had every right to retire and go off to Churchill and feed his swans, he wrote, of course, his extraordinary war memoir. If you were in the Kremlin, he started the Cold War. I'm not saying I agree with that, but they saw him as a Cold War warrior through his speech in Fulton, Missouri. To my great surprise, I didn't realize this until, 3 years ago, when I first started really getting into the deep depths of the documents. But Churchill privately advocated at least 3 times that a preemptive nuclear strike be made against the Soviet Union. So concerned was he about Soviet adventurism. But he never said that in public. While writing his memoirs and, of course, leading his party, he was a constant critic of Clement Attlee, who Churchill thought was feeble in his following up of that Quebec agreement, something that Attlee vehemently denied. By the time Churchill returned, astonishingly, to be Prime Minister again, as in the words of the great Roy Jenkins, gloriously unfit for power. It's meant affectionately, it's not meant to be an insult. In 1951, in the first weeks there, he saw, to his total astonishment, that Attlee's government had spent some £100 million, about £1 billion these days, on developing a nuclear programme. Churchill had completely sidelined Attlee during the Second World War. Attlee knew nothing about the nuclear programme. Now it was Attlee's turn. He completely sidelined Churchill and had, as Prime Minister, built this started to build this very expensive weapon. Comment I want to make here is that it's surprising, I think, that Churchill's first reaction to that is, why do we need this weapon? Why do we need a civil nuclear power programme? And contrary to the writings of C.P. Snow, I think Linderman, whom Churchill brought back into government pretty well immediately, once again, Linderman was the person who talked him round, right, to continuing that bomb project. And I don't think that's something that Churchill regretted in the long term. He regarded that as an example of Linderman's good judgment. And it was for that reason that Churchill became the first British Prime Minister to have nuclear weapons and the leader of the first really big civil nuclear power programme. That was one of the achievements of that second Churchill administration. He was looking for a way out in glory, and he found it when reading a Guardian article in 1954. We even know the date, the 18th of February. He loved the Guardian. Yes, he loved the Guardian. And he read this article, which showed Churchill the power of the hydrogen bomb. He told Eisenhower that when he read this article, his eyes almost popped out of his head. This bomb the hydrogen bomb makes the one dropped on Nagasaki and on Hiroshima look like a firework. Churchill realized that with the tensions of the Cold War and the possibility of these weapons was something that could be potentially appalling, not just for those governments, but for humankind. And he, in my opinion, brilliantly pioneered what we would, in our modern language, would call détente, where he would sit at the table and bring the Soviet Union and America together to talk about how we deal with these weapons. In my opinion, and indeed out of quite a few others, this makes Churchill a pioneer of détente, commonly credited to Gorbachev and Reagan. Churchill also was overseeing a development in nuclear research at Harwell, and we see him visiting that on the 30th of December 1954, having gone there and said, "Take me to the neutron." And it was at this meeting here that, aged almost 80, he did his first nuclear physics experiment. I know the person who actually showed him how to do it. Quite remarkable. Less than 3 months after that picture was taken, Churchill had resigned and gone off to Sicily. And on that holiday, Linderman, another heroic gesture from a not particularly well-liked person, Linderman persuaded him that Churchill, his legacy, should be to sort out the funding and found an institution that would greatly improve the quality of scientific and technological education in Britain. Notice, not liberal arts education, scientific and technological education. And that institution was to be Churchill College, as we now call it. This is him giving a speech on site on the 17th of October 1959, much of the funding in place for this, in my completely unbiased opinion, this glorious institution. Chairman, I hope you'll give me an extra 60 seconds for that. This was an example of a couple of sentences from that speech, the second to last public speech he gave. He was talking here about the lunar rockets. As with many vehicles of research, pure research, their immediate uses may not be apparent, but I do not doubt that they will ultimately reap a rich harvest for those who have the imagination and power to develop them and to probe even more deeply into the mystery of the universe. This was appropriate, ladies and gentlemen, for the man, Winston Churchill here, who in his government, right, was the first UK government to give the go-ahead to British participation in the CERN laboratory, which just a couple of years ago gave us the Higgs boson. So here it is, Churchill College, the National and Commonwealth Memorial to Winston Churchill, where 70% of its intake of students are students of science and technology, although we hugely value experts in other subjects as well. It houses not just this hive of activity here, but also the great Churchill archive that I use and many, many other scholars use to study his lifetime. It was at a reception here that I met his youngest daughter, now the late Mary Soames, and I remember her saying to me you know, Graham, she said, it's very important to remember that my father was as much a writer as he was a politician. And those words struck with me, because as a writer, Churchill was unquestionably, in my view, a nuclear visionary. If those words mean anything, that's what he was. He wrote about the coming nuclear age. As a politician, during the war, it seems remarkable that he was less aware, that he was not, more aware of of nuclear potential, so to speak. I don't think he demonstrated as much foresight as we might have hoped if he'd really come to grips with that issue. But in his second term, he always wanted to surprise us. He was the person, I would argue, at an international level, who saw that the game of just having more and more weapons in the hands of powers that were each other's throats could not continue. We had to live safely with nuclear weapons. So in that sense, I submit that 1.5 out of 2 qualifies for our Winston Churchill to be called a nuclear visionary. Thank you very much.